Julie Satow is an award-winning journalist who has written about the topics of real estate and New York for more than a decade. A regular contributor to the New York Times, her work has also appeared on National Public Radio, Bloomberg Business Week, Travel and Leisure, and elsewhere. A recipient of multiple awards from the National Association of Real Estate Editors, as well as the Newswomen's Club of New York, her essay, Under the House, was published in the anthology Modern Loss, A Candid Conversation About Grief. A graduate of Columbia College, she has a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. The Plaza is her first book. Please welcome Julie Satow.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Debbie, for having me. And she was telling me a little bit about your group, and it sounds really fascinating. And I would like to come to one of your other events. They sound really great. So as it was said in the intro, this is my first book, and I'm happy to talk about why I ended up writing the book, and any other questions you have. But I thought what I would just start with is going through some of the images that I have in the book and telling you a little bit about it, just to familiarize yourself with the story of the Plaza, which is really a fascinating story about New York City and a social history of America for the past 100+ years. So I will begin at the beginning, which I have found often works well. So this is actually an image of a skating pass. Before there was ever a Plaza Hotel, the corner of 59th Street and Fifth Avenue was actually a pond that, when frozen over, was really, during the winter months, was really like the playground of the very wealthy of New York. It was actually a clubhouse, a skating pond and skate club, and this is a ticket, a season ticket for what was very exclusive and called the Fifth Avenue Skating Pond, and it dates from about 1863. Before the Plaza of today was erected, there was actually an original Plaza Hotel, which is seen here in this image, from about 1894. For a time, it really was one of New York's grandest hotels. It stood about 8 stories tall, and it was made from brick and brownstone, and it had about 400 hotel rooms. At first, the original Plaza drew a who's who, like General W.T. Sherman of the Union Army, who hosted a very famous party there for many of his fellow soldiers. But only a few years after it opened, the hotel was overshadowed by the far more glamorous Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And only about a dozen years after this first Plaza Hotel opened, it was sold to 2 partners who immediately tore it down. So here we have construction workers in 1905 who are removing the foundation of the original Plaza Hotel, which I had just shown you. Critics were absolutely shocked that the new owners paid what was the equivalent of about $90 million to simply tear down the hotel. But a key reason was the fact that the original Plaza, it lacked a steel skeleton, which helped erect skyscrapers and was very critical at that time for building much taller buildings. So the new Plaza that we're all familiar with does have the steel skeleton. Before this steel structure was invented, buildings needed very thick curtain walls on the lower floors in order to handle the weight of the building that was rising above. But this obviously limited the height since these curtain walls could only be so thick. So this steel skeleton was very critical, and it will come into play in the next slide. So this is Harry St. Francis Black. There's a version of him as a young man, and one when he's a bit older. We think he's probably in his 60s there. Harry was really a very fascinating character. He not only constructed the Plaza Hotel, he actually built the Flatiron Building on 23rd Street in Manhattan, the Macy's department store on Herald Square, and several other quite notable buildings. Harry actually began his foray into real estate when he went to the Chicago World's Fair and he met the teenage daughter of George Fuller, who was the man who actually invented that steel skeleton that allowed for the construction of skyscrapers. When George died, Harry took over his father-in-law's construction company. And from that base, he bought more firms and he built more buildings. And he eventually created what was the first ever real estate empire. He was very handsome, as you can see from these images. And not long after marrying George Fuller's daughter, he actually divorced her and he became a man about town. As the owner of the Plaza Hotel, he led quite a lavish life. He owned a Pullman railway car and he lived in an enormous penthouse on the top floor of the plaza. Harry was also a very big believer in stocks, especially during the 1920s jazz age. In fact, he was such a big Wall Street booster that he tried to sell stocks in order to fund his real estate project, which was a very novel idea. Unfortunately, the Wall Street crash of 1929 was not kind to Harry. He did become financially ruined, and he actually tried to drown himself in the bathtub of his Plaza penthouse. His valet revived him, and he did survive, but about 8 months later, he tried again, and he did die by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. This is the Plaza in 1920, before Harry Black died, and the hotel was really in its heyday. I love this image because you can really see that it was sort of this gleaming white tower that absolutely dominated the skyline. The other image in this slide is of Henry Janeway Hardenberg. He is the architect who designed the Plaza Hotel. Hardenberg also designed the Dakota apartment buildings on the Upper West Side and the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel, not the Waldorf that we all know. The original was actually torn down to build the Empire State Building. So it was quite unusual in New York, even way back in 1907 when the Plaza was built, to have a site that was just so visible from so many facades. So Hardenberg decided to take advantage of the Plaza's visibility, and he constructed what was essentially a classical column. The first 3 stories of the Plaza are made from a rusticated Vermont marble, and they form the column's base. The column's shaft is finished in a cream-colored terracotta brick, and the famous sloping mansard roof, which features very ornate dormers and gables, is actually made from copper and slate, and the green was meant to reflect the green of Central Park right across the street there. Hardenberg himself was a very interesting character, simply because so little is actually known about him. Even though he was quite famous, even in his own lifetime, he gave very few interviews. It is known that he came from a well-known old Dutch family, and who helped found Rutgers University in New Jersey, but it isn't clear whether he ever had children or was even ever married. This is an image of Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the very dashing New York millionaire, and his first wife, Elsie French. Vanderbilt was actually the first guest to ever register at the Plaza Hotel. His mother, in fact, lived next door at the Vanderbilt Mansion, which is where the Bergdorf Goodman department store now stands. But just about 6 months after Vanderbilt moved into the Plaza, he actually divorced Elsie French when he met a woman horseback riding along the Central Park's bridle path. This caused all sorts of scandals, as I'm sure you can imagine, especially with his mother next door. But Vanderbilt would eventually become a hero when a few years later he was on a ship called the Lusitania. It was actually hit by German torpedoes during World War I, and Vanderbilt is credited with running around the deck of the ship as it sank, saving all these children and putting them into the few available lifeboats. He even gave his own life jacket to a woman, although he did not personally know how to swim, and his body was never recovered. So this is one of my favorite slides. This is a photo of the Plaza's Fifth Avenue facade on its opening day in October 1907. As you can see, the Fifth Avenue entrance that many of us may be familiar with did not yet exist. That wouldn't be built until the 1920s. But this photo is important for a different reason. These are actually the first ever New York City taxi cabs. They were introduced to New Yorkers on the Plaza's opening day, and to attract a wealthy clientele, they were offered free to Plaza guests as a way to sort of drum up publicity. But they soon replaced old-fashioned horse-drawn hansom cabs as New York's favorite mode of transportation. I always find it ironic that today, the only place one can find horse-drawn hansom cabs is directly across the street from the Plaza, where the New York City taxis that marked their death knell were first introduced. So, just a fun tidbit. This is the Palm Court, also on opening day in 1907. It was a favorite room from the very start. One of the first weeks, in fact, that the Plaza opened, a British actress, Mrs. Patrick Campbell, made quite a scene when during the bustling tea hour, she decided to light a cigarette. This was something that only women of ill repute did, and it certainly was not something that was done at the Plaza. The staff sort of went into a panic until finally a brave waiter came and asked her to please put it out. The actress shot up to her full, very tall height. She dashed the offending article onto the floor and stomped out, never to come back to the Plaza again. The Palm Court is also famous, aside from dramas like that, for its curved ceiling, which you can sort of make out in the corner of this image. It was originally open to the sky to let in sunlight and sort of created this garden-like ambiance in the room. That ceiling was actually removed in the 1940s in order to install air conditioning units, but in 2005, when the Plaza went under a massive renovation, the owners found some shards of the glass of this original ceiling up in the attic, and they used it to recreate a similar ceiling. It cost about $1 million to do, and it is not open to the sun now. It is incandescent flashlight, light bulbs rather, that give it its glow. In 1920, the country went dry under Prohibition. Crowds who had once spent their nights at the Plaza's Oak Room or the Edwardian Cafe now shunned areas of the hotel, and instead they went to illegal speakeasies like the 21 Club, where they could drink to abandon. The photo on the left here, on my left, so your left, is actually Lillian Gartner Palmetto, who was a mural painter, and on the right, it's the singer Hildegard. During Prohibition, it was very, very difficult for the Plaza. As I said, most people preferred going to illegal speakeasies and didn't really hang out at the hotel anymore. The Oak Bar was actually removed, and the room was turned into a brokerage office for E.F. Hutton, while other areas of the lobby were just basically shuttered or even turned into storage areas. But in 1933, the dry laws were finally repealed, much to the Plaza's relief, and the hotel celebrated by turning the corner of Fifth Avenue and West 58th Street into a very swanky nightclub. The Persian Room, as it was called, featured a 27-foot bar and these murals that were painted by Miss Palmetto, who was painting one there. And one of its most famous acts was the beautiful chanteuse Hildegard, who is seen here in the 1940s performing. She was a really big hit with soldiers, and this photo is actually from 1946. Okay. So one of my favorite stories of the Plaza that I uncovered was that of the elderly dowager widows who called the Plaza home. They were famous for stationing themselves in the lobby where they would often remain for hours on end. They ended up becoming sort of a meme of sorts, a sort of a tourist attraction in their own right. And they were eventually dubbed the 39 Widows of the Plaza. Although I could never really figure out where that phrase came from, since there were, or why it was 39, since there were about 200 of them. So the widows were not actually a new phenomenon. In fact, when the hotel opened, about 90% of those who checked in were actually permanent residents, and the idea of a hotel and an apartment was somewhat interchangeable. One of the first of the 39 widows was a Russian princess. Princess Vilma can be seen in the upper corner there holding a dog. She was actually quite an accomplished portrait painter, and she was even considered a child prodigy, but it was definitely for her collection of animals that she became best known. When she checked into the Plaza in 1909, she brought with her a family of alligators, a monkey, an owl, and later a pet lion that she purchased from the Ringling Brothers Circus and that she kept in the bathtub of her Plaza suite. The Plaza eventually insisted that she remove the lion, who she called Goldfleck, and so she gave the lion to the Bronx Zoo, and when it died, she actually buried it in Westchester in a pet cemetery that's still there. You can go see. There is also a man in the lower right corner with a cowboy hat on. That is actually Conrad Hilton. In 1947, Hilton bought the Plaza. He was just sort of starting to make a name for himself, and this was his first really big, famous hotel purchase. The Plaza widows considered Hilton an uncouth Westerner and an outsider, and they were quite mean to him. Hilton was in fact married to the movie star Zsa Zsa Gabor at the time, and he did try and modernize the hotel. It was Hilton who in fact removed the ceiling of the Palm Court to install air conditioning units, and he put television screens into all the hotel rooms, things like that. The widows were beside themselves. They felt like he was completely ruining their home, but Hilton did his best to try to reassure them. He actually wrote them long letters explaining his strategy for the hotel, and he would smile and try to charm them when he saw them in the lobby. The widows mostly gave him the cold shoulder, but I think eventually there was some kind of detente between them. So, okay. These are photos of Kay Thompson. In the 1950s, Kay was really the most famous thing about the Plaza. Kay originally wanted to be a movie star, and she went to Hollywood, but she only ended up having one starring role. She was the Diana Vreeland character in the movie Funny Face, featuring Audrey Hepburn, who some of you may be familiar with it. But instead, Kay was really not considered a beauty, so she was relegated to behind the scenes, where she became a vocal coach to stars like Judy Garland, who actually became her best friend and named her the godmother to Judy Garland's daughter, Liza Minnelli. But Kay eventually grew sick of being behind the scenes and trying to make it in Hollywood, so she decided to start a cabaret act. It was actually very, very successful, in no small part because Kay liked to wear pants, and pants on women back then in the 1950s still being very unusual. In fact, she created her own clothing line, Kay Thompson's Fancy Pants, which she sold at Saks Fifth Avenue. And she also performed quite regularly with the Williams brothers, who some of you may be familiar with, including Andy Williams, who's in that image there on the left, and who was actually her boyfriend for a while. But while Kay was definitely a notable cabaret performer, it was certainly in book publishing that she truly became famous. In 1955, after performing at the Persian Room at the Plaza, she actually met a young illustrator, Hilary Knight, and they joined together and published the first of what would be the Eloise books. The Plaza had been doing fine up until then, but all of a sudden they were inundated by a whole new generation of young fans. And they were so grateful for all this free publicity because Eloise, obviously the precocious 6-year-old who likes to throw water down the mail chute, lived at the Plaza, so it created all kinds of free publicity. So they were so grateful that they let Kay live at the hotel for free, off and on for decades. But eventually, in the 1970s, when the city and the Plaza was under severe financial duress and was near bankruptcy, the hotel realized that Kay by then was much older and she wasn't going to be publishing any more Eloise books. So they actually evicted her and they gave her only 24 hours to leave her rooms. So it was quite dramatic. Okay, in 1964, the Beatles stayed at the Plaza for their first New York visit, and the staid hotel staff was absolutely overwhelmed with hordes of hysterical teeny boppers, which you can see in this image here on the left. They're all running to greet the Beatles as they arrive via taxi. Interestingly, I found that the Beatles almost never made it to the Plaza. Back when they had made their reservations, they weren't yet household names in America. And the Plaza merely thought that 4 British businessmen were coming to stay. It wasn't until about 2 weeks before they were set to arrive that someone asked the Plaza's manager if he realized that the Beatles were coming. Immediately, the manager decided that he simply had to cancel the reservation because the Beatles' image did not match the rarefied atmosphere of the Plaza. So he came home that night to his family, and over the dinner table, he explained his day and how he was canceling this reservation. However, the manager had a 12-year-old daughter. There she is in the other image to the right. Her name was Lourdes, and she was, as you can imagine, absolutely inconsolable that her father was going to cancel on the Beatles. She became so hysterical, in fact, that like any good dad, he eventually relented, and the rest is history. In this photo with Lourdes is, of course, Ringo, Paul, and George. John was supposedly downstairs mingling among the crowds, trying to be incognito by wearing a ski mask, which I'm not sure how well that went. Also in the photo is Lourdes' best friend, Bunny Castellano, and her little brother, 6-year-old Greg. You may notice that Greg's hand is hovering over his belt area. That's because moments earlier, Paul McCartney had stopped the photographer to point out that poor little Greg's fly was unzipped. So, just another fun tidbit. Okay. Shortly after the Beatles came to the Plaza, Truman Capote threw himself the party of the century in the Plaza's grand ballroom. The black and white ball, as it's known, heralded the most coveted guest list in the history of parties. Here you can see Capote, who stood about my height, just barely 5 feet tall, heading into the fete with his date, Katharine Graham, who was the newly installed publisher of the Washington Post at the time. But just a few years after this image was taken, in 1969, the innocence and glamour of the Beatles and the black and white ball was replaced with unrest. Topics like the Vietnam War, civil rights, and women's equality were dominating the headlines. The Plaza soon became a target of their ire. The old-fashioned Oak Room was actually only one of 2 remaining restaurants in all of New York that did not allow women in. It was sort of this all-male bastion where businessmen would retreat after a day of Wall Street and smoke cigars and hang out together. So the National Organization for Women, or NOW, decided that they would target the Oak Room. So in this other image, you can see a bunch of the feminists. They're picketing in front of the Plaza Hotel. Soon after this photo was taken, they actually went into the dining room, the Oak Room dining room, and attempted to get served. Unfortunately, instead, the waiters came and took their table away, leaving the group of women just sitting around an empty space. Supposedly, some of the male diners felt bad for them and gave them some breadsticks, but eventually the women did walk out feeling quite defeated. However, about 2 months later, the Plaza's Oak Room did announce that it was opening its dining room to women, so they were successful. Okay. Following the unrest of the 1960s, the 1970s were not much better. New York was plagued by drugs, a soaring crime rate, and bankruptcy, or near bankruptcy, I should say. In July 1977, there was a citywide blackout, and for 2 days, residents dealt with looting and arson. In this image here, the darker photo, those are actually guests at the Palm Court during the blackout, forced to dine by candlelight. The city also suffered the indignities of countless sanitation strikes. The other photo was taken in 1975 and just kind of shows you what it was like. This was, there had been a multi-day garbage strike that resulted in the Plaza's basement being filled to capacity with garbage. So with no room left inside the building, the hotel staff began dumping its garbage outside, creating these enormous piles, which one reporter actually went with a tape measure and said they were soaring over 7 feet high. So finally, the 1980s arrived. This decade brought shoulder pads, hairspray, and of course, Donald Trump. There he is, sitting in his office on the 26th floor of the Trump Tower, which, as you can see, had a direct view of the Plaza. There it is right behind him. Trump always loved the hotel. He would often stare out at it through his window when he was considering his next big deal. He called it a masterpiece and the Mona Lisa. So at the peak of the era of excess, Trump paid what was a historic sum, about the equivalent of $500,000 per hotel room, to purchase the Plaza. As soon as Trump bought the hotel, he appointed his wife, Ivana, who can be seen in the other image, as the president of the Plaza. During the press conference announcing her hire, Trump famously said that he would pay her $1 and all the dresses she can buy. Ivana actually kept that $1 framed above her desk at the Plaza. This was actually the first and only time, even up through today, that a woman has held such a position at the Plaza. And by most reviews, Ivana was incredibly tough and detail-oriented, but very effective. She was famous for getting down on her hands and knees, dressed in her Chanel suits, and showing the housekeeping staff exactly the proper way to make a bed. She would stare out with binoculars out at the Plaza at the front entrance and make sure that there was no garbage. And if there was, she would call down to the doorman and make them remove it. But while Ivana did, in fact, help Trump turn the Plaza around from the very difficult 1970s, and it was doing quite profitably under her presidency, Trump had made quite a bad business deal. He had, in fact, borrowed the entire sum to purchase the hotel, and he kept adding additional debt onto the hotel. So no matter how well and how profitable it was running, it wasn't enough to pay down the debt service. So just about 3 years after Trump purchased the hotel, he became the only owner in its 112-year history to ever bankrupt the Plaza. Just the facts, not giving anything political. Okay, on to the next. Here we have, eventually what happened was Trump's creditors, after he bankrupted it, took over the Plaza, and they sold it to the highest bidders, who was a Saudi prince, Al-Walid bin Talil, and his partner, a billionaire from Singapore. It was actually the beginning of foreign ownership of the Plaza, which is a trend that continues through today. This slide is actually of the Saudi prince as he stands at ground zero on October 11, 2001, the 1-month anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks. As the owner of the Plaza, Al-Walid wanted to express his support for the city, so he took his private jet from Riyadh and he flew to Ground Zero. And as you can see here, he handed then Mayor Rudy Giuliani a $10 million check to help with the rebuilding effort. However, just hours after this photo was taken, the Saudi prince issued a press release where he criticized American foreign policy, and his comments drew immediate censure, and Giuliani quickly returned this check. The next day's New York Daily News headline read, "Mayor Giuliani told a Saudi prince to take his 10 million and stuff it." So that gives you an idea for what the atmosphere was like. By 2004, New York had largely recovered from 9/11, and it was going through a historic real estate bubble. Everyone was building condominiums and making tons and tons of money doing it. This included an ambitious Israeli developer, Mickey Naftali. You can see him all the way on the right here holding this check. This is a check for $675 million, which is the amount that he eventually paid for the plaza. Mickey bet his whole reputation on making a deal for the hotel. He had actually tried to buy another hotel on Central Park, but he lost out to a competitor. So instead, he decided to set his sights on the plaza and do everything he could to get it. He figured that if he could buy the hotel and convert it into apartments, into condominiums, he would make a killing. But considering that Mickey was Israeli, he decided not to approach the Saudi prince to try to buy the plaza. Instead, he spent weeks trying to find the Saudi prince's partner, the very elusive Singaporean billionaire Kwek Lang Beng. You can see him here. He's the third from the right. Finally, Mickey received a fax, this was many years ago, notifying him that Kwek Lang Beng would meet him in his office in Singapore the following day. So Mickey raced to book a flight, and over a marathon negotiation that lasted more than 12 hours, he finally clinched the deal for the hotel. And this photo was actually taken at the closing ceremony for the deal. And this time, unlike the Saudi prince at Ground Zero, the check the men were holding was definitely not returned. So Mickey carved the plaza into about 200 very expensive hotel apartments, rather, and left a small boutique hotel, about 300 rooms. In 2012, he finally finished selling all the apartments, and he made about $1 billion in profit. He decided that it was finally time to sell the small boutique hotel, about the 300 rooms that remained, and the buyer was Subrata Roy, a very colorful Indian tycoon. This is actually a photo of thousands of Roy's employees. He was very famous for these grand displays. So these are thousands of his employees standing in about 110-degree heat, singing the Indian national anthem. Subrata Roy wanted to break a Guinness Book of World Records, which he did. Roy actually, he lives in basically what was essentially a small city. His house is actually modeled after the White House in Washington. He has his own cricket court and helicopter, full-size soccer stadium. He owns a Formula One racing team. You get the idea. He also claimed to be best friends with people like Mother Teresa, and he hobnobbed with Bill Clinton and lots of other politicians. Unfortunately, here's a picture of Subrata Roy about a month after he bought the plaza. His empire essentially crumbled. This is an image of him. He was walking into the Supreme Court in New Delhi when a critic threw a bottle of black ink at him. The issue was he was accused of essentially defrauding about 30 million very, very poor Indian farmers of their entire life savings by selling them fraudulent bonds. And the courts ordered him to pay back more than $3 billion. right after this photo was taken, you can see his bodyguards here. They rushed into the crowd, and they quickly beat up the heckler in full view of all the television cameras. And I went to visit Subrata Roy, and he is always surrounded by a lot of men wielding machine guns, which I'm happy to tell you about after the slideshow. Anyway, Subrata Roy was ordered after his shenanigans to spend about 2 years in one of the most notorious prisons in Southeast Asia. And while there, he ran the plaza from his jail cell. Subrata Roy is now free on bail, but he's still prohibited from leaving India. He only actually visited the plaza one single time, and he never stayed at the hotel. So, about 2 years ago, Roy lost the plaza, and he essentially could no longer afford it, and the country of Qatar in the Middle East bought the hotel. During the time that Subrata Roy owned the hotel, any money that the plaza made was siphoned off and sent back to India to help him pay down his debts. The Edwardian room was closed, the Oak room was closed, and unfortunately today it remains much the same. With COVID, it has made it even worse. The hotel is actually closed now, and it has been for several months. And if you happen to go by it, you will see that the windows are all boarded up to prevent looting. But I hate to end on a down note, so I'm still quite hopeful. As I say in my book, the plaza was built in an era before radio and exists in the time of Facebook. Like a white marble mountain rising in the center of the city, it stands weathered, permanent, and implacable. So thank you so much for listening to this brief overview. I would like to just add that I am selling my books on Amazon. This is a very small selection of what I cover. There's lots of fun, amazing stories. It's on Amazon or wherever you like to buy your books. And I'm also happy to sign any of them. I know it's a little hard in a digital world, but if you send me your book, I can sign it and send it back to you. I've been doing that quite a bit. So thank you so much. I don't know if anyone has questions.
Yes, please, everyone, type your questions or comments or stories or whatever in chat, and I will read them. But that was absolutely fascinating.
Oh, good.
And I just loved the book. I like just, which is why I wanted to invite you here.
Well, thank you so much.
Just really recommending it to everybody. To me, you know, it reads more like a novel. It's just so compelling and so interesting. You're just a wonderful storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
And as you said, there are so many more, you know, fascinating stories in the book.
Yes.
I especially love the Eloise stories.
Oh.
When I was a girl, I was a big Eloise. I had all the books, and I remember distinctly I had a pillow that said, "Sleep with me, Eloise." And I kept thinking about that
really
pillow
funny.
when I was reading the book.
Kate Thompson is such an amazing character. I really loved learning about her. She was so upset that it was considered a children's book. If you notice, it says like a book for precocious adults. There's actually quite a lot of very adult references in the book. Now, if you look back at it as an adult, you will notice that she never had children, and she did not think it was appropriate for kids. So just a funny.
Okay, so here's a nice comment from Sherry. I'm halfway through the book and it's fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
And Nancy said, I would like to see, okay, I can't understand what she's saying, but she said, where did you get all the photos?
Oh, many different places. From, you know, so I spent about 3 years researching the book. It was sort of a combination. I know this isn't one of the questions, but I'll just tell you a little bit. So I spent a lot of time, obviously reading a lot of archival newspapers over the years, but I also did a lot of interviews. So it's really a combination of things I found in, out of print memoirs I found of people who worked at the Plaza when it first opened, or images that people gave me. For instance, the one of the Beatles where the little boy is holding his hand over his zipper. That was Greg Salamone, the son of the manager who told me all those stories. So, it really ran the gamut.
Jennifer's asking, what was the most surprising thing you learned about the Plaza while researching it?
Yeah, I mean, so the way I approached it was, before I wrote the book, I had never written anything longer than like a magazine article. So it was really overwhelming. So I started doing research sort of chronologically. And one of the things I found was that the library has digitized so many newspapers. So it used to be, I don't know if any of you remember, like in high school, you used to have to use microfiche to go through and find old articles. But that makes it really hard because if you don't know what you're looking for, you can't search a specific date, let's say. But now you can just use it almost like Google. So I could put in the Plaza and I came up with tens of thousands of articles. So one of the things I was able to discover all these stories that had been sort of forgotten to time, that were maybe big deals at the moment they had happened, but then if no one kept repeating them in his history books, they were forgotten. So one of the first was I found a murder that actually happened when the Plaza was under construction, which was probably one of the most exciting things, just because I couldn't believe no one had ever written about this. And it was so crazy. While the construction was going on, there was the construction workers were very upset about their pay, essentially. And there was a kind of an argument going on, and they threw someone off the unfinished 8th floor of the hotel. So it was a huge scandal at the time, but no one remembered it. So that was probably one of my most favorite. That and the stories about all the very eccentric widows that lived there, who are just amazing stories.
Okay, there's no name, just initials. JCB said, what made you choose the Plaza as a topic?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist, and I have covered New York City, and I've written about real estate. That's like my main beat for many, many years. So the Plaza was actually converted in 2005, 2006 by Mickey Naftali into condos. It was a big deal at the time in the city, and people were very upset, and it meant losing a lot of hotel jobs. So I covered it for the paper back then. So I knew about the Plaza. I also grew up in the city, and I went to high school not far away. So I would always hang out in Central Park, and I knew the hotel, and then I covered it for the newspaper. And then I was very lucky when I got married in 2009, I got married at the Plaza. So it was always a story of a hotel that I just thought was so fascinating and amazing. So I kind of always had that idea. And as I started to decide I wanted to write a book, I started researching it, and I couldn't believe no one had written a book about the history of the hotel since actually 1967. And so much had happened there. And I feel like it's such a great lens through which to tell a social history of New York, which is really what I wanted to do. So it just was kind of the perfect confluence of like personal things, and also it just working really well for a book.
And Nancy said, I wondered if there's any truth to the different tops of the Christmas trees in crystal done by a former hotel employee.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I have to say, since the book has come out, I have gotten so many emails from people who know interesting stories or learned things from their aunt or uncle who worked at the hotel. So there are many, many, many stories and that I did not come across or could not cover, but I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that one.
Roxanne is asking, what is the country name, the name of the country that owns the Plaza now?
Now, Qatar or Qatar, I don't know, Qatar. So basically, the government owns it, owns the boutique hotel. Yeah.
Oh, this was great from Susan. I was part of the Beatles crowd, part of the women's movement to change the Oak Room policy, and for years had my hair done at the Plaza.
So did I. That's so funny. I got my hair done there before. That's awesome. Wow. Well, I hope you read the book. I think there might be a lot. I'm sure you'll email me and tell me I missed a bunch of things, which is, but you know, I am on social media. I love hearing from readers. So definitely share like your stuff. It's so fun. That's really cool.
And from Chris said, I spent my wedding night at the Plaza in July 1974.
Tough times for the Plaza back then.
Yeah. And Olivia says, such a wonderful presentation. Thank you from someone who always had tea in the Palm Court with my mother.
I know.
You don't mention the Tiki Bar.
Yes, Trader Vic's. Yes, a lot of people, it is in the book. Yes, my dad used to go there. He was like, he couldn't afford anything, but he would go like with his college buddies. I mean, it was definitely like the place to be. And it was, you know, very famous. And actually it closed because Donald Trump said it was, when he bought the hotel, he felt that it was cheesy. So he closed he closed Trader Vic's. And yeah, the basement has where Trader Vic's has had an amazing history. It was everything from a restaurant where they actually used to pour water on the floor and create ice skating down there, to Trader Vic's, to all kinds of things. And now if you go, once the Plaza opens, if it ever reopens down there, it's a food hall, actually, if anyone's familiar, which is actually very good. It's very delicious.
And then Nancy, who asked a couple of questions. Thanks for your kind reply. Fascinating and fun facts.
Oh, good.
I especially love the part with that fake Duke Baron.
Baron Gunnar Covey. Yes, that is a crazy story.
Yeah.
I know. I always love that story too. I don't know why. So basically, there was a very colorful guy who checked into the Plaza, and he was a baron, and he was a very, very fancy dresser. But it turned out he was a complete charlatan, and was actually the son of a dentist from Budapest, and was definitely not a baron. And it sort of played out like a Greek tragedy. I felt like, you know. He wooed a very wealthy heiress, and it led to all sorts of very sad things happening. So that was another example of a story that I never read anywhere else, that I was able to uncover just by finding these old newspaper stories. So.
And then Donna says, I spent my wedding night there in 1964.
Oh.
First husband. Okay. I also ran galas for nonprofits in both the Terrace Room and the Grand Ballroom. And I know that Donna worked for many, many years in the nonprofit field. So I know that was a popular place.
Very popular. It's interesting. What happened was, after the hotel was made into condos, and I don't get into this, but first of all, the condos are also really fascinating. All these incredibly famous, wealthy people now live there. I think the most expensive condo is a $60 million one bedroom, which houses a billionaire's art collection, just to give you an idea. But when it was carved up into condominiums, they actually made the ballroom a kind of separate entity, and they leased it out to a third party. So it's part of what is difficult for the hotel itself, because they're not actually in control of the booking, the galas, and all the things that happen at the ballroom. So it's sort of a weird structure there. But
Susan says, I'm a Big Apple greeter, and I take a lot of people there. One family gave me a mug from the food hall from their country, England. It's in my kitchen.
Oh, so nice. I know someone sent me like a bunch of Plaza things. So cool. It's, you know, that's why it's such a special place, because it has so many memories and history. I say somewhere in my book, you know, it's as famous as like the Brooklyn Bridge or the Empire State Building. It's this icon. But what's so great about the Plaza is people actually live there or stay there. It's peopled with, you know, people's stories and characters. So it's very rich for all that. So neat.
Okay, so I think we're gonna end now. This was just great. Julie, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
And please, you know, find me on social media. I'm just at Julie Satow. And as I said, my books, and anyone can email me if they'd like to buy one and they want me to sign it. I'm happy to do that. They make good gifts. Throwing it out there.
It's a great book, as I said.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Okay, great. Okay,
everyone stay safe. Bye.